All right, we're going to get started. Well, this afternoon we're going to be finishing up with compliance. So we're going to have the different oversight organizations or relevant people speaking about that. We're going to start off with Nicolette Peterberry, he represents USDA Animal Care. Peterberry.
Hi, everyone. Today I was in the mammal session with Bob, and the way he introduced me was, this is Nicolette Peterberry, who's going to give you all the hardcore answers. And actually, I'm not going to give you hardcore answers. What I'm going to try to give you is a paradigm. And I hope you will use that paradigm and thought processes in your reviews of wild animal activities. So the AWA definition is research involving regulated species of wild animals as a field study, and I'll talk about that definition in a minute, but it's any research involving regulated species of wild animals. Research that is not a field study is subject to the same requirements under the Animal Welfare Act as any other type of regulated research, with the exception of field studies, and here's the definition. It means a study conducted on free-living wild animals in their natural habitat. However, this term excludes any study that involves an invasive procedure, harms, or materially alters the behavior of an animal under study. Crystal clear, right? So there are two other places where field studies are mentioned in the Animal Welfare Act regulations. And one is in terms of the semi-annual inspection, and that animal areas containing free-living wild animals in their natural habitat need not be included in such inspection. And there's one other place, and that is protocol review, provided that field studies, as defined in Part 1 of this subchapter, are exempt from this requirement. So what does this mean? The way I see this, we're kind of on the horns of a dilemma here. What you had in the Animal Welfare Act definition of a field study is a performance standard, and with a performance standard, there's a lot of latitude. In my day-to-day work with stakeholders, every day I'm answering questions from IACUCs, from PIs, from attending veterinarians who say, what am I supposed to do with this? So it seems that there's, at least among some of you, a desire for more guidance, and yet there's also a desire for autonomy. But keep in mind that with more guidance comes more prescriptive guidance, because we're doing the interpretation for you. And honestly, I don't mean to be a downer, but I don't think you can have it both ways. So either you have the performance standards and you decide how best to fulfill those performance standards, or you can request more prescriptive guidance, but that guidance is more of an engineering standard. And you can also argue that some engineering standards can become problematic if they no longer fit because they become outdated, or if it clouds the issue of welfare and becomes more an issue of checking the box. So one of the reasons I'm here is to find out what works for all of you. And so I'm hoping that you will try to come to as much of a consensus as you can, because we want to represent as many of you as possible. And come up to me at any time, tell me what you think. I can bring it back to our agency leaders and move forward from there. But what do we do in the meantime? So every field study or every animal activity involving wild animals is like a snowflake. They're all different. So I'm hoping you'll continue to call me and go through some of these problematic issues. And one of the ones we were talking about before was net gunning. And some of you may call me and say, look, we've got this situation where we're net gutting. Is it a field study? And you would expect that your USDA representative, me, would say, oh, I can tell you exactly what the answer is. But what I will probably do is ask you a whole bunch of more questions. I would be asking you what species it is, who's doing the net gunning, how do they do it, are you convinced that they're doing it the best way possible, who have you talked to that convinces you of this. If you don't know these answers, go back and ask. You as the IACUC, I'm saying. Okay, what happens immediately after the net gutting? What happens shortly after the net gutting? What happens after release of the animals? What happens immediately after, and what happens later on down the line? So it's all of these questions that you should be asking to determine if this is an issue. I will, without fail, talk to you about any welfare concerns I have. That may be separate from whether it's regulated under the Animal Welfare Act. And I will tell you, I have a lot of welfare concerns about net gunning. But ultimately, the answer may be different for different facilities depending on the answers to those other questions that I might be asking. So remember that while no protocol review is required for field studies, the IACUC is responsible for all animal activities at their institution. And because of that, you at least need to know enough about that activity to determine if it's regulated or not. And as a best practice, you should be more concerned about whether there are welfare issues or not, which could reflect on your institution, which could reflect on your assurance if you have an assurance. So always try to get as much information as possible, and that takes a lot of forethought. If you're not going to be using a protocol, you can use whatever you like, but think about it. Think about what information you would want as an IACUC to feel reasonably certain that you understand that activity. And as I said, make sure that you get enough information to meet your needs. Points to keep in mind are that many activities that use wild animals are not actually research. Wildlife management, once again, clear as mud, right? I can walk you through the questions to ask step by step. Generally speaking, I think a good indicator of whether something is wildlife management is whether this is a question directed to a discrete population of animals under your purview, or whether it's a general question about the species. That's a starting point. There are lots of other questions that I'm sure you guys could bring to me that would help you elucidate that. Population control is not considered a field study or a regulated animal activity. And as we discussed before, use for food or fiber. So I can't promise you any hard and fast answers, but I can promise you that if you encounter any challenges, you can always call me or call the Western Hub office, and we will try to walk you through the issues and help your IACUC arrive at the appropriate conclusion. And some of the other things that we can do that I have done in the past is if there's issues that involve multiple players, multiple agencies, or maybe the PI and the IACUC all want to be on a call, we're happy to try to accommodate that. We can get together a conference call including multiple individuals from multiple areas of your institution or outside of your institution and work through problems together. So the one thing I would like to say that really impressed me about the mammal session that we had this morning is that the vast majority of you folks were not as concerned about whether something fits into a box of being a field study or not. You were concerned about the welfare. And I can't tell you how impressed I am, because working with regulated facilities, doing regulated activities every day for the past 10 years, that's not something I always see. So it seems to me that you guys are incorporating best practices already, and I do salute you for that. And if there's any way I can help you in the future, please reach out. Thank you.
We'll take questions at the end, which is, if you haven't figured out, that's our format. Okay, Ellen Paul, you speaking now?
Nope, no pretty pictures this time. So this is sort of a grab bag of issues. Compliance is depicted on this slide as a circle of authorities. And in fact, that's actually not true. There is actually a hierarchy. The hierarchy starts with the U.S. Constitution. So Civics 101, for those of us who forgot the 5th grade, which is, pretty much everybody, the federal government only has authority as given to it by the U.S. Constitution. So there has to be a specific legal basis in the Constitution before they can write any statute at all. That then gives the U.S. Congress, those geniuses up on the hill, there's another word I was going to use and it wasn't genius, the authority to write statutes, and the statute in this case is the Animal Welfare Act, which is 7 U.S. Code. When you see USC, it means U.S. Code 2131 and et sec, fancy Latin for and following. The regulations are then a matter of assignment by the Congress or within the statute, or in the case of some agencies such as the EPA, which is an independent agency, or at least it used to be. Now it's barely an agency at all. They are assigned authority generally by the statute. It'll say the Secretary of Agriculture or the Secretary of Interior or whoever shall write regulations to help implement this. Statutes are generally fairly vague, and they don't involve a lot of specific statements about implementation. Sometimes there are some, but generally not, and they tend to have gaps as well. So the statute tells the agency, who has people with far more expertise, to write regulations. And then that agency may also write what we call sub-regulatory documents, such as guidance and policies. In this case, a good example is the Animal Care Policy Manual, which is a compilation of documents on specific issues. There's also the inspection guide, which is actually meant obviously for the VMOs, but is also very informative for all of you. And they're online. They're not hidden documents. There is by law a requirement that when an agency regulates under the green box, that they publish the proposed regulation for public notice and comment, and they are then required to consider those comments and respond to them in publishing the final regulation. For the other documents category, there is no such requirement. However, the Office of Management and Budget has a document called the Good Guidance Best Practices, or as I call it, the Good Guidance Guidance. This came out under the Bush II administration. It is still in effect, although observed mostly in the breach, and it sets up a 2-tier process for public participation in this sub-regulatory realm, one being significant guidance, which is defined as over $100 million and affecting over $100 million in economic activity, and the other is at lower tier. OLAW, which is not a regulatory agency, its policies are actually grant conditions, has a practice of always publishing these things on its website and seeking public comment, even though they're not required to. And I laud them for that very strongly. I really think that's the best way to go, because we have to have a partnership. We have to be able to talk to each other in order to have effective policies that work for both the animals and for the researchers. So pick a law, any law. Here's issue number 1. Is your protocol subject to the Animal Welfare Act or PHS policy, or both? And again, I'd like to thank OLAW and also NSF for helping me make sure I get this right. We now have in our Model Wildlife Protocol an explanation of which policy applies and when. So Animal Welfare Act, initially enacted in 1966, regulating the transportation, sale, housing, handling, and treatment of animals in research and exhibition, as implemented through USDA's regulations through the public notice and comment process mandated by the Administrative Procedure Act. It applies when, and here are the 2 triggers: any research facility, which is defined as any school, except an elementary or secondary school, institution, organization, or person that uses or intends to use live animals in research, tests, or experiments, and that, now number 1, purchases or transports animals in commerce. It has a legal meaning. Again, remember, there has to be a constitutional basis. The constitutional basis in this case is crossing state lines. When you have transactions across state lines, that gives the federal government constitutional authority to act. So if you were getting lab rats from Carolina Biological and shipping them to New York, that would come under this first provision, okay? But for wildlife, that's pretty uncommon. You can't sell most wildlife, for one thing. And most people don't often transport across state lines. It does happen, but it's not common. especially if you live near a border, obviously. But we aren't normally bringing animals into captivity either. We study them where they are and leave them there. The second one is the one that really applies to virtually everybody, and that receives funding under a grant, award, loan, or contract from any federal agency for the purpose of conducting that research. Basic requirements we all know. You must register with APHIS, you must have an ICOOC process and review protocols, annual reporting, inspection, except for bird facilities because there is no standard established as of yet. Health Research Extension Act of 1985 gave NIH, and NIH then directed it to Office of Laboratory Animal Welfare, an assurance agreement that's submitted by the institution to OLAW. And again, that's required by OLAW because you have a grant from that agency. Now, there's also memoranda of agreement between OLAW and other agencies, and currently those are the why do I have VHA? I mean Veterans Affairs. I have no idea why I got the H in there. NASA and National Science Foundation. Obviously, that can change over time. The memoranda of agreement might expire. Other agencies might sign these memoranda of agreement. So even if your funding is from VA, NASA, or NSF, you're still subject to PHS policy. The legal structure for this particular statute is, as I said, the Health Research Extension Act. Notice that regulations is blank. OLAW is not NIH rather, is not a regulatory agency. Its policies are implemented as grant conditions, an agreement, a contract. That's essentially what you're signing is a contract. And in fact, they have a host of additional documents, including PHS policy, the facts, of course, they incorporate by reference the ILAR guide, and so on. There are key differences, as I'm sure you know. And I'll skip that one since I've covered it. So I'm waiting for somebody to laugh because they recognize what this species is. Nobody, no birders. That's a mouse bird. So what about rats, mice, and birds? I got a twofer in there. That's a mouse bird. Okay, that was a lame attempt. We're talking to you about this at lunch. What if you do a joke and it flops? There it goes. You don't die. What's the status of the rule? I mentioned this earlier in the first talk, but in 2000, the USDA decided to cave in response to litigation and said, yes, we will regulate rats, mice, and birds in research. It had been previously excluded by regulation, by the definitions. In 2002, as a result of pressure primarily from the biomedicals, the Congress amended the Animal Welfare Act to say rats, mice, and birds bred for use in research, rats of the genus Rattus, mice of the genus Mus, were actually going to be excluded again, leaving wild rats, wild birds, wild mice included, which is really odd when you think about it, because that's really the hardest thing for anybody to address. In 2004, the regulations were formally amended to include rats, mice, and birds except those purpose-bred. And in 2004, the agency published an advance notice of public rulemaking. That's not the same thing as a proposed rule. This is going out and saying, tell us what we should cover. What issues should we address? It's a really good practice that almost no agencies use. And so kudos to APHIS for having done this. So they did have a comment period, not on a proposed rule, but on what the public thought the proposed rule should address or not address. We gave them an earful. I had a long list of don't addresses, but this went on through 2012 when they issued a stakeholder announcement saying program is currently in the process of clarifying how we plan to implement the regulation upon finalization, particularly aspects pertaining to birds. Animal Care is committed to moving the regulation forward, but only with enforcement guidelines that are feasible and in alignment with existing federal resources, which of course have taken a nosedive since 2012 and are scheduled to essentially disappear next year. So all of this conversation is really hypothetical for the next 3 years, unless miracles happen. More indictments. So the status of the rule. I just adore that somebody drew a heart around this poor little guy. It's, we believe, dead. As I mentioned earlier, there was every 6 months, the Office of Management and Budget publishes a compilation of all regulations that are in some stage of development, and this one didn't appear on any of the 3 lists, so I have to assume that it is in fact defunct, that it is not moving forward. So birds get a free pass, right? Right? Well, you're all here in the morning, and presumably you're awake, so you know what my answer to that is going to be. standard federal grant conditions. And here we have been discussing this with APHIS. I'm not just coming here and talking to you. I have gone to the Associate General Counsel and to the Deputy Director, and I've said, look, you've got a problem, because we are required by law under the standard federal grant conditions to comply with the Animal Welfare Act. Now, it's true that you don't have standards for birds, but those standards apply to birds in captivity. And I get that. Okay, so you can't have standards, you can't inspect facilities. But what about protocol review? What about IACUCs? What about reporting? And putting on my lawyer hat here, if you want to be in compliance with the terms and conditions of your grants and contracts, you have got to comply with the Animal Welfare Act, even if it is birds. So, this is the standard form 424B. You will comply with the laboratory, I don't know where they got the word laboratory from, Animal Welfare Act of 1966. When is it going to come back to bite you? When you have a problem and somebody says, wait a minute, you were required to comply with the Animal Welfare Act and you didn't even put this through protocol review. Now, since it sounds like most of you are doing it anyway, and that's a practice I encourage, good, keep doing it. And a lot of you are doing it because you're getting funding from Public Health Service Agency, NSF, and NASA. And whatever your reason is, good, keep doing it. Our position at the Ornithological Council has always been, these are sentient vertebrate animals that are no less physiologically capable of feeling pain, and I'm not going to use the word stress or distress because we don't know where the line is or how to measure it in wildlife, certainly not in the field. But certainly some kind of adverse reactions to your methods, that there's no physiological or ethical reason to exclude them. If I were at a university, birds would be included regardless of the lack of a regulatory standard for keeping birds in captivity. And then again, remember PHS policy, an animal is any live vertebrate. So there you go. So the opportunity to exclude birds is shrinking, 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 and if you really want to comply with the law, which you really should because this is a compliance talk, there will be no bird exemption. Now, it gets better. Last year, Congress enacted the 21st Century Cures Act. I'm not going to say this is going to exempt birds because it isn't. But what it is going to do is have NIH, the Secretary of Agriculture, and the Commissioner of the FDA by December 2018, so the clock is ticking, to review applicable regulations and policies for the care and use of lab animals and make revisions as appropriate to reduce administrative burden on investigators while maintaining the integrity and credibility of research findings and the protection of research animals. I know that OLAW is in fact planning a fairly robust outreach process, which again is to be encouraged. And in fact, they are required to seek the input of experts, but experts and stakeholders are not always completely in overlapping groups. So I really, again, laud them for going the step beyond and making sure they're including the stakeholder community. They are to identify ways to ensure regulations and policies are not inconsistent, overlapping, or unnecessarily duplicative, including with respect to inspection and review requirements. Take steps to eliminate or reduce identified inconsistencies, 3 members versus 5, warm-blooded versus vertebrates, and take other actions as appropriate to improve the coordination of regulations and policies with respect to research with laboratory animals. I did clear this with Axel, so I know that I'm saying it correctly. The plan is to hold discussion on the status of the progress made by the 3 federal agencies and to engage stakeholders at several professional meetings. Per OLAW, the communication method to the public is still under discussion, but there will be outreach with an opportunity for public comment. Follow the websites. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on permits, having done quite a bit of it in the bird session and not wanting to bore those poor people to death again. But what I did want to do is the take-home message is that by imposing limits on the number of animals that can be studied based on the population status of that species in that place, that the IACUC can sort of not focus too much on this. Not saying they should ignore it, but you have the assurance that a group of people with more expertise than you do has already looked at it and issued a permit saying this is okay. The types of permits that we deal with in the bird world are Migratory Bird Treaty Act, Endangered Species Act, which is where now mammals come in. No, obviously no mammals are covered under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. CITES, which is rarely going to apply. This is primarily an import. In fact, it's all an import-export issue. Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act, Wild Bird Conservation Act, which is again an import-export issue. Marine Mammal Protection Act, which is probably the hardest kind of permit out. There's 2 levels, but they're both fairly tough to get. And place-based permits, national parks, national forests, national wildlife refuges. Those are to protect the resource, but also to deal with things like user conflict or management. I mean, if the agency itself is doing some kind of management, such as controlled burn, they don't want you out there. So those place-based permits are in addition to all of the others, and they address overlapping but also different issues. State permits generally cover all taxa, and sometimes the permits cover places and times, but more often they have a requirement for notice of when you're going to go out and where you're going to be working. That's it.
Stay tuned. Yeah, I don't even. Should be. Yeah, that's good. Now representing OLA at NIH, Dr. Axel Wolf.
Thanks, Greg. Okay, I'll start my talk with the exact same slide I started with yesterday, just to kind of reiterate that contrary to the other oversight or regulatory agencies, we cover all vertebrate animals, and if you're supported by PHS, NSF, VA, FDA, CDC, then what I say applies to your institution and your situation. IACUCs are to determine that the proposed activity is likely to alter or influence the study animals or other species in the study area, and if there's no effect, no IACUC review is needed. This is not really a foreign concept to us at OLA, because the grants managers call us a lot with a proposed grant that involves animals. However, some of them are purely observational, and we tell them on your grant application, even though you're looking at animals, your study involves animals, your publication involves animals, you're not doing one of these things that alters or influences the study animals. So you're exempt from this, and on your grant application, you put down no vertebrate animal use. So that's an unusual concept, because you're using animals, but you're really not. You're just watching them, or you're picking up fecal samples or something. And why this is important is because if you check yes for vertebrate animal use, the entire force of the PHS policy comes down on you. Then you need an IACUC, you need an assurance, and that's a lot. If you're a brand new investigator, you don't know that, and you're at an institution that's not assured, but you're going to be doing this, there's a lot of delay and expense for the institution. So we're asked quite often, there's a grant application, it talks about animals, and do they really need an assurance? Do they need to have IACUC oversight? So we've had to rule on this decision, and it's not as complicated for us because we've done this a lot. And some of these studies are difficult to determine. We had one that was a malaria study where all they really wanted was the mosquitoes. So they put a cow out in a shed, and they put some kind of trapping device around it. I don't know if it was tanglefoot on sticky stuff or whatever, but they were trying to catch mosquitoes. And so we said, is the cow the study animal? Are you doing anything to that cow that the cow wouldn't be otherwise doing, which is sleeping or chewing its cud? And they said, no, we're putting this around the perimeter of the cow. So we said, okay, you're not using a vertebrate animal. You're using an invertebrate, and so you're off the hook. But some of these, unfortunately, they think they're not using an animal, but they are. And so then they need an assurance and IACUC approval. I'm just going to reiterate the guidance that was read out here a little before. This is actually our most recent revised guidance on field studies. So for field studies, the PI must inform the IACUC where the activity will be conducted, what procedures will be involved, description of how the procedures are likely to affect the biology and ecology of the study animals, but also other species in the area, and describe the relationship of species to habitat and other species in study areas. So we're very concerned also with the bycatch animals, even though you might throw them back or something like that. If we get reports of a lot of bycatch animals that have died, they're live vertebrate animals. They may not be your study animal, but they're sentient animals that perceive pain. And if they're suffering, we need to make sure that institutions taking actions to mitigate that. Then an assurance must, the IACUC must assure that permit requirements of pertinent local, state, national, international wildlife regulations will be obtained before work begins. That doesn't mean that the IACUC has to get that permit. The IACUC just needs to be informed about that. And our guidance has said all along, we don't accept contingent protocols. In other words, you can't tell an investigator, yes, your protocol's approved, but you still need to get biosafety committee approval or OC Health approval or something like that. In this situation, it's a little bit different. The IACUC can still say the protocol is not approved until you get biosafety approval. However, because we realize permits are very difficult to obtain, and we assume that the wildlife investigator knows for a fact they can't start that animal work until they have the permit. And this is not different from when we issue at OLA restricted approvals for studies that are coming around at the end of the fiscal year. So an investigator has a study pending. They don't have IACUC approval yet. However, we don't want that money to go back to the Treasury. So we allow the funding institution to fund that protocol, but there in big, bold letters it says, your grant's been approved. However, you can't actually start the animal work until that IACUC approval's been submitted to NIH. So we do have a precedent for that. So we don't really consider this as a contingent approval. We consider it as an approval that can't actually have the animal work begin until the permit's obtained. Investigators are encouraged to consult relevant professional societies, available guidelines, wildlife biologists, and veterinarians as applicable in design of field studies, because we realize that the guide for the care and use of laboratory animals doesn't address all these different taxa. So we do encourage folks to go to all these different resources to find out information that's maybe more relevant to what they're actually doing. Consult the IACUC if health and safety of personnel or animals' environment could be impacted, and we just had a very good bunch of talks on that. Okay, so we require compliance with the guide, the animal welfare regulations, the U.S. government principles, and the AVMA guidelines for euthanasia. And as I mentioned yesterday, your method of euthanasia possibly may not be in the AVMA guidelines, and there is the ability to ask for an exemption for a different method, scientifically justified and approved by the IACUC. The IACUC must ensure that studies are in accord with the guide if it involves capture, handling, confinement, transportation, anesthesia, euthanasia, invasive procedures. So any kind of touching of the animal requires adherence to the guide. For free, and then as Nicolette said, for free living, wild USDA covered species that involves invasive procedures, harms or materially alters the behavior of an animal, that requires IACUC review and approval. And the PHS policy always has stated that you must be in compliance with the Animal Welfare Act as appropriate. Semi-annual inspections. Our field sites are not required to be inspected by the IACUC. Some IACUCs send back pictures from investigators that are there, and so have an idea of what's being done. That's not unusual in this day and age. It's very similar to how our foreign assurances work. We don't expect a domestic IACUC to go overseas, check out the site, and so we've seen very interesting, creative ways that investigators have shared how things are conducted out in the field or in foreign facilities. The IACUC needs information to consider risks to personnel and impact on study subjects. So it's important to reveal as much as is necessary about that. And again, the IACUC needs to be informed that appropriate permits are in place, but the permit work can't be, the work cannot be started until the permit's in place, but the protocol can be approved prior to that. And that's all.
Now representing the National Park Service, Tracy Thompson.
Thanks, Greg. All right, so we're going to change things up a little bit. I'm going to talk with you more about how the National Park Service decides to be compliant with the federal regulations and policies. So, is this wildlife anesthesia? This may be, oh, we're at a presenter view here, aren't we? Anyway, this may be as odd to some of the folks in the audience that aren't from Wyoming, as this is to the laboratory animal researchers with regard to anesthesia in the field. So this is an actual field procedure going on with mule deer for research purposes. But what kind of information, again, do we all need to have in place, and what policies do we need to have in place to ensure that we are being compliant when we're out there in the field? Oops. So background, just briefly, the National Park Service became certified with USDA Animal Care as a federal research institution in 2009. Through a lot of reflection and pondering and recognizing that there were activities occurring within our Park Service units with the animals for which we have jurisdiction over, our branch chief, Dr. Margaret Wild, decided that we really did need to look very closely at what we were doing out there and whether or not we were in compliance with the Animal Welfare Act, in particular with mammals. And it was determined that even though USGS, who's the Department of Interior's research arm, is very active in field research activities for DOI and also has IACUCs available to them, they weren't really going to be able to be responsible for a Park Service and our management policies and our requirements for protecting and preserving our resources under the Organic Act. So we did decide that we needed to have, in order to be compliant with the Animal Welfare Act, have our own institutional certification as a research institution and a properly constituted IACUC. We've got our mandatory 3 members, and while it's allowed, it's not preferred. I hold both the chair and the attending veterinarian's role, but we also have 2 non-affiliated members, and then we have 7 regions that are represented on our committee. All are either wildlife biologists or park personnel, or we do have 1 law enforcement officer for our kind of lay person on the committee in order to provide a different perspective from a park to our committee that's mostly biologists. We do look at regulated use of all vertebrate animals within NPS territory, and the reason for that is as the Department of Interior is a signatory to the Interagency Research Animal Committee that developed the 9 U.S. government principles back in 1984. So we do follow PHS policy essentially because of the U.S. government principles, even though we are not, and at this point don't plan to be assured. We don't receive NSF funding directly. Most of the researchers that come to us with NSF funds are associated with another institution, but that is potential in the future. We also haven't pursued ALAC accreditation yet either, but that also may be something we look at in the future. So what I found, I've only been with Park Service since 2015. I was a USDA VMO before that and helped work with a lot of the folks at Park Service to develop their program and identify where they could take a wildlife only research activity oversight program to a new level for a federal agency. So we kind of break ours down in those 4 W's and H. It's kind of just a routine way that we proceed through things. And the first one, the where, for us is pretty no-brainer. If it's not within NPS jurisdiction, we don't have authority to look at it. If our personnel are out working in other places, we probably need to know about that if they're working for our NPS, but the IACUC itself is not going to need to have oversight for that. Who is really important. We have a lot of folks that want to use animals in the public lands. It's a wonderful, beautiful laboratory, and it's all of ours. However, as I mentioned, the Organic Act, we have very specific mission with regard to preserving and protecting resources for you and for your future generations. So we have different parks that look at that in very different ways, in terms of no hands-on to wanting to be very involved with researchers and knowing more about the animals that are under their care. So those folks that are within the Park Service that are doing their own research activities, they come to us, they're reaching out to us, they want us to review things even that sometimes would not be considered covered under the Animal Welfare Act or under PHS policy. But those outside institutions, once we start seeing protocols coming to us from academic or government or nonprofit research institutions, we automatically look at those. To me, the most important question is why. Why are they coming to the Park Service to do this work? It's not so much the scientific merit as it's why do they need to use our animals in particular. There are a lot of other places that people can go to access wildlife. And so that is a big question that we ask. And in conjunction with that, why do they need to come to Park Service? Is the work really research focused or is it management focused? And I'll get to that here in a minute. So we do evaluate that why quite heavily as to why they're coming to us to do the work. The how and the what really are probably one box. I just split them out here to separate out kind of that field study oversight versus what's actually happening out in the field. But they really are the same thing. Once we've looked at these and determined that, yeah, this is research, we really need to look at this more in depth, obviously we're going to do a more thorough review. One of the issues that we deal with in Park Service is we are a management agency. We're a federal management agency as well as a park environment for folks to come and enjoy the wildlife there. And so we do have management policies and management activities that involve our wildlife. And we had a lot of questions about where our authority lies as an IACUC to review some of those activities. So under a lot of multiple folks reviewing and talking and coming up with ways to look at what little guidance we have from just the field study definition from the Animal Welfare Act. What do those terms mean? Things such as invasive, things such as harm, things such as materially altering behavior. And when do we apply welfare standards to activities that would be either field study or management activities? So we've got a guidance document. This is just one page. This is a wonderful little graphic that Ali helped put together to sum it all up for the visual learners in our group and to put it all in one place. As I mentioned, we look at who first. You know, once we've determined that these people that are coming in are probably likely to be associated with research activities, it goes either direction into one of the two chains. The blue side, the left side, is really focused in on those management objectives. Is this for adaptive management purposes? Is it tried and true methods? Is it written up in a management plan? Is it something that is designed to assist the park in managing resources only? And if that's the case, we do not require that to be reviewed. However, a lot of our researchers or our park personnel might want us to, so we will do a review for them if they choose to and if they think they might publish later, but it's not something that we're requiring. The secondary research component, and I don't know how many of you run into this, is we've got animals in hand, so why not do something while we've got them? So what we're looking at is we will focus in on that aspect of the work. We don't look at the management activity that would be done regardless of that opportunistic research being collected. We're just going to look at the research components, the qualifications of the people involved, the purpose, and how invasive that procedure is. And so the right side is really where we kind of distill things down to either field study, we don't know, so maybe we want to look at this a little bit more closely for a short period of time and suggest a pilot study, or absolutely this is research, testing, training activities that would be covered either under the Animal Welfare Act or under our U.S. government principles. So that's kind of how we've distilled things down for ourselves in order to make sure that we are meeting at least the minimum requirements for review, but also helping our parks direct the researchers to us for different activities that they are presented with at the park level. I wanted to talk about refinements. I think this has come up quite a bit in the past day and a half, 2 days now. One of the challenges that I think we face as an IACUC, I mentioned concurrence reviews, since we do have folks from other institutions that want to come to us, but we have our own requirements and our own policies, and we are just a wildlife research IACUC, so we have a little bit different expertise and a little different lens than maybe a lot of IACUCs look at. We look at each protocol and often do an approval with conditions. And that approval with conditions may be using a different method of euthanasia. It may be having one of our park biologists go out into the field to observe the handling and qualifications of the personnel. It may be making sure that they report back to us sooner rather than later, not just on adverse events, but on how the captures went, especially if it's using a mechanism that maybe we are not real familiar with, and that we want to make sure that things go well, especially with high-profile species. That's something that we want to make sure that we're touching base more frequently. I had one come to us that was going to be taking bats and putting them in respirometry chambers for multiple days. And we had a lot of concerns about this. Again, why would you need to come to a Park Service unit to do this work? So we do look at these very closely, and we don't just disapprove protocols, we try and work with the PI and with the parks. If the parks really want this research to go forward, then we look at ways that we can still suggest refinements in the methods that they're using if there's animal welfare concerns. Amendments and annual reviews, we get a lot of really good information out of those documents from our researchers. They provide us adverse events, they provide us the outcomes of non-target or opportunistic species that they've had, suggestions for refinements that they've come up with on their own. At lunch, we were talking a little bit about fish captures, and I'm going to show you a picture here in a second of things that these PIs actually suggested to us after their experiences. Before I show you anything, I meant for this to pop up later, this link that's in your slide set. If you are not familiar with the National Agricultural Library, that Animal Welfare Information Center, and don't have that bookmarked on your homepage somewhere, please do bookmark that. And this particular link goes directly to their wildlife page for IACUCs. So they have a really great set of suggestions for keyword searches and search strategies, appropriate databases for biological resource research instead of just your usual laboratory animal research. But this little guy is not normal. My fish people know what's going on here, but has anybody seen this or know what it is? Barotrauma, I heard, absolutely. So I think Dr. Cook mentioned that deep water fish, the pressures are pretty significant, and here we're pulling them up to work on them on a boat. There's a risk for either on the way up or the way down, or both, for their air bladders to become overinflated, and this can be fatal. So our researchers who were doing some fish work that did involve some deep sea fish went to an alternative search, and they found commercial fishing options, and they amended their protocol to add in what this is a commercial product called a sequelizer, but it's available to fishermen out there that do a lot of deep water fishing, and I guess it's designed to help relieve pressure as they drop the fish back down or back up. There's less manufactured ways to do this, baskets, and I think Steve mentioned maybe a containment or some way to lower or raise the fish up slowly and return them slowly. But there's refinements that can be provided from a lot of different sources. So making sure that you're looking or doing alternative searches in the right places is really important. Sorry, that's the USCS Barotrauma Project. So the other thing that we run into is we are national parks, public lands, and we have a lot of visitors, especially in some of our parks like Rocky. It's insane how many people will show up to come and see this beautiful park. How do we deal with the public? And I mentioned this on the first day with regard to open beaches where you might be working on an endangered species, but one of the compliance requirements for all of our regulatory agencies is reporting animal welfare concerns. When you've got folks out in the field doing wildlife research, how does that happen? Who's able to report? How do they even know where to report their concerns? So I wanted to have this picture up here, and that, hypothetical. We've got this guy at one of the parks. He's talking to one of our wonderful volunteers, which we have tons of great volunteers in the parks, and they're concerned about this. How would your IACUC deal with this? Or how do you have a mechanism in place that someone could help report concerns that maybe the steer has been improperly immobilized or left to recover in a way that wasn't appropriate? So we on our website actually have our big red button that says report animal welfare concerns here on both our public and our internal site. It lists the mechanism for how someone would report animal welfare concerns directly to us and how the IACUC can respond to those depending on whether they want to be anonymous or not. We encourage them to go directly to the folks on site first to deal with the issue because we don't want them to call us up and then 2 weeks later it hasn't been dealt with. But we do have that mechanism, and it's a way that we've still been able to be compliant with the Animal Welfare Act's requirements for reporting animal welfare concerns. And luckily, so far, the only incident was before I came on, and we didn't have this mechanism in place, but the PI self-reported, and we were able to suspend a protocol and work on it, helping refine what they were doing so it wouldn't happen again. But we do have a lot of folks, like I said, that come to our parks, and we are often, Rocky's a classic example. If any of you have been to Rocky Mountain National Park, the elk are rather gregarious, especially this time of year. We aren't darting this time of year right now, but when we do go out, we dart from the vehicle on the road alongside of everybody else that's pulling up to look at the elk. So having those volunteers in place to discuss what we're doing, and then our team, after we're done and the animal's been reversed and released, we'll go over and talk with the individuals that are around and make sure that they understand what we're doing and why and how it benefits the animals in the park. So as I said, adverse events, reporting animal welfare concerns. When it comes to wildlife, do you have a mechanism in place, and how do you decide when work stops and how to report that information and to whom? So as I said, we've come up with our own mechanism. We do have a mechanism that we report directly to our IO, who would work directly with the superintendent if it couldn't be resolved on site. So that's really mostly what I wanted to share with you. Is we've come at this from a perspective of it's the right thing to do for us to have an IACUC. The work that's going on in our parks is important, but we want to make sure that we're compliant and that we have appropriate ways to ensure that compliance. So between our IACUC composition, the post-approval monitoring and inspection protocols that we're starting to put into place now, and also the reporting of animal welfare concerns or adverse events, as well as capturing amendments and changes that the PIs can direct to us. That's what we're doing. Anybody know where these are? One closest to me. Nope, not Yosemite. Nope. Rocky Mountain National Park, that's Mills Lake. Top in the middle? Excellent. Chaco Canyon, and if you haven't been there, you need to go. And then Grand Canyon, of course, right? So there's so many beautiful places, and we have a lot of great wildlife research going on out there in our parks. If you are going to be coming to the parks, I mentioned already a little bit that we have a permit system that is required for you to at least come into the park to do scientific work and collection. And then we also would need an IACUC review of your project if you're working with vertebrate animals. So definitely feel free to reach out to Allie and I anytime. Allie's in here today the last couple of days as well. She's my administrative assistant, has been really awesome about helping us develop ways to track our animal numbers, reporting the appropriate ones, not the ones that we don't want to report. So if you're working on developing new ways to look at your wildlife protocols and managing data out of those, talk to Allie about that. Thank you.
He's wearing a tie, so this must be Robert Sykes doing ALAC.
Yes, I do have my ALAC tie on, not the ASM tie. Okay. Reminder for this slide is that ALAC International is a voluntary accrediting organization. And what do we cover? All vertebrates. And if you want us to cover your cephalochordates, we'll do that. If you want us to cover your cephalopods, we'll do that. It really is up to you to tell us what animals we should cover, and typically it's the vertebrates. However, we did modify the definition of animal, and we do, in fact, pull in cephalopods now. Okay, but again, it is voluntary. This is something that you sign up for. It's a peer review accreditation process. So the people that come in walk in your shoes in terms of being PIs, in terms of being ICUC personnel, and in terms of coming typically from accredited institutions. So it really is a peer review process. We have just under 1,000 institutions worldwide right now as of the last Council on Accreditation meeting, which was in September. And of those almost 1,000, 97% of our institutions are in full accreditation status. That means that they have gone through all of this accreditation process and they're maintaining that full accreditation status. When ALAC comes in for a site visit, as I said yesterday, we come in with at least one member of the Council on Accreditation or a Council Emeritus, or in addition to that, we come in with one or more ad hocs. The ad hocs are consultants or specialists brought in for specific expertise so that our contingent that's coming into your organization really has the expertise to cover the breadth of the animal use at your institution. We have 2 findings that we can leave you with, and occasionally no findings. That's even better. But ALAC has 2 types of findings. It's either a mandatory or a suggestion for improvement. A mandatory is an item that is a deficiency which must be corrected for full accreditation to be awarded or to be continued. What is a mandatory? It's one of these things that is in conflict with one of the must in the guide, which is one of our standards, or it's something that jeopardizes the welfare of animals or humans. These are things that absolutely must be corrected for accreditation to continue. The other type of finding is a suggestion for improvement. These may be, these are items that the council feels would benefit your program, your organization, but they are a suggestion. As the institution, you can ignore those. We're giving them to you as a recommendation, something that we feel would benefit your program. And you may have a commendable program. You may have a program that earns a exemplary status in terms of our letters to you, but we could still leave you with suggestions for improvement. These are optional. If we look at the findings, and this slide is a bit dated, so this is I think 10 through 14 in terms of the findings. 88% of the findings in that time span were suggestions for improvement, and only 12 were mandatories. By and large, that means that institutions are doing a really bang-up job in terms of adhering to those standards. Top 3, over that same span of time, the top 3 mandatory deficiencies identified during site visits. First was occupational health and safety issues. Second, institutional animal care and use committee oversight issues. And finally, HVAC was tied with institutional administrative items. But again, this is 14 data. This has just been revised, and the evaluation is ongoing. So what I want to give you next is some very preliminary stuff that I persuaded the front office to provide me before I came to this site visit, or before I came to this meeting. This is not a site visit. So new trends in site visit findings. This is from 14 through 2016, and this is 999 site visits. They couldn't come up with one more. 999 site visits. Okay, the analysis started in most detail with OC Health issues, and we did see a change in the number one spot. It is no longer OC Health. Now, animal environment takes top spot as the one that we find the most mandatory items on. OC Health dropped a second. Veterinary care, third. So, and then ICUC, OB. Those are the ones that are making up the vast majority of the mandatory findings. Physical plant, okay, which ones of these are really going to be hitting wildlife type issues? Physical plant, not so much, because we're doing most of this work in the field. When you bring them in, obviously that's of concern. Let's go through this in a little bit more detail. Findings specifically relevant to wildlife. So I asked them to go through the data that they had and pull out the findings that are specific to wildlife type situations. Number one, and these are not necessarily in order of highest frequency, but fairly close, okay? Occupational hazards. And this comes right back to the talk that we had earlier today with Chris and Patty. Do your due diligence. Make sure your institution is capturing those issues that are specific to wildlife. I'm sorry? Okay. Second item, this is one that comes up very, very frequently. MS-222, preparation, disposal, grade of MS-222. If you're using this compound and OLAW comes in for a site visit, we're going to go to those labs. We're going to find out where you're using this compound. We're going to go to those labs. We're going to talk to the PI or the graduate students that's there. Okay, do you use this MS-222? Tell us how you prepare this compound. Tell us how you use this. Oh, I just dump it out here and stir it up with my iced tea spoon. But I do wash my iced tea spoon before I use it for stirring my tea. We want you to tell us how how you prepare this compound. It is an inhalation hazard. That means it's going to be a personnel risk. Now, this would typically be a suggestion for improvement unless the mispreparation is rampant throughout the institution. Also, under OC Health and items that did not quite come up to the level of the MS-222, but are OC Health specific, the protocol form did not prompt for hazards relevant to fieldwork. Now, this is not stuff I found. This is stuff that all site visitors have found over this past 4 years. Precautions not considered for envenomation. And this is particularly for those sites that are housing venomous snakes or where the researchers are working in the field with venomous snakes. And this is primarily snakes. Specificity of the risk assessment. Again, back to the talk that Patty and Chris gave. Do your due diligence on identifying the hazards relevant to this field work and make sure you're mitigating those risks. Transport of wild-caught animals. How are they being transported? What type of vehicle, etc. And how is it sanitized afterwards? Remember, these things are coming out of the field. Protocols did not include actions needed if animals were injured during activities, for instance, trapping. Are there contingency plans for animals that are injured? What are those contingency plans? How carefully has the institution thought through this process? Procedure for classification of activities as field study is unclear or inconsistent. How many times have we heard that today and yesterday? In other words, do your due diligence, make sure that there's a process in place to clearly identify when you are meeting that field study category, when you are not, and that it's the ICUC that's making that decision. Additional findings relevant to wildlife. Humane endpoints not identified. Ernie made this point yesterday. Identify those humane endpoints. When you bring the animals into the lab, that the diet, the housing, the microenvironment in captivity is not appropriate for wild animals. You cannot bring a wild house mouse into the same lab that you have lab mice in, put them in the same environment, treat them the same way, and think that they're going to behave just like a domesticated house mouse. Same species, they're not domesticated. You need different circumstances for those wild animals, and the IACUC needs to have thought this through. Animal use on protocols, animal use on protocols listed as field studies were in excess of the numbers approved. Now, yesterday, Tracy put up a slide. What about one animal over? We're not talking one animal over here. That's not what draws these types of findings. Quite simply, usually this is where there's not record keeping between to match between the two. And this last one, genetically modified animals used as feed for wild taxa. It's great to use excess animals for food. You know, we talked about this with reptiles, with birds, not when they've been genetically modified. This is something your IBC is going to be very interested in. So these are the findings relevant specifically to wildlife. Again, 3 standards for the ALAC accreditation. Guide for Care and Use of Laboratory Animals, number 1. ETS 123, primarily European, and the Ag Guide if you're looking at agricultural animals. The reference resources, as I mentioned yesterday, are important. The ALAC recognizes those and reviews them and accepts them as reference resources. Now, not all of our taxon guidelines are up there right now. Right now, it's the bird and the mammal guidelines. That doesn't mean that ALAC Council does not use those other taxon guidelines. They do. Even though they're not listed as reference resources, that means they simply haven't been reviewed by the council with specific exceptions and cautions. That doesn't mean they don't use them. They do, because it is the best resource for those taxa. And Chris made the point yesterday that, yeah, the HERP guidelines may be 2004. That doesn't mean that they're not appropriate, that they're not applicable. They are. They just may not be as current as could be. Okay, so these are your resources, and most importantly, the front office. If you have a question about your ALAC accreditation suitability, reach out to ALAC. We are a private organization. We are not subject to Freedom of Information Act. That's a big deal when we go on these accreditation site visits. If you have a question, we will respond to you. This is peer-to-peer evaluation. And that's it.
All right, we have time for questions, and I'll start that one off, maybe for Tracy. So if I have a fictitious animal, the famous Reinhard jogging caribou up in Alaska, and this thing crosses the state in Canada, and I'm doing some tracking study at the end, when it dies, I want to necropsy it. Get some blood sample and stuff, you know, before and after. So it's going in and out of parks, over state land, private land, borders. How does that work in terms of permitting? General kind of statement.
General statement. So yeah, we certainly recognize that very few of our animals are in a situation where they are kept behind fences. There's a few, but most of them are free ranging, right? And so we often are collaborating very closely, especially our park biologists or regional biologists that cover those areas. Alaska's always a unique place. Sorry for those of you all from Alaska, but we do get a lot of collaboration with the Department of Game and Fish. And so if I'm not sure of the percentage, but many of those projects that are involving movement of animals, especially game animals like caribou, are often funded by the ADGR, Alaska Department of Game and Fish, ADGF, and they work very closely with our biologists. They're usually co-collaborators. So we have jurisdiction over our lands. They would either have arrangement with the park to come and go to access those animals, because I would guess that's management activity that you're talking about right there, but maybe not. And then if there was a research component, we would be doing a concurrence review on any of their approved protocols.
And the other incident, other
Anilka lands. So we do have relationships again with the tribes. We have representatives in the regions that work with those tribes to make sure that those relationships are in place. Obviously, if it's for sustainable harvest or other purposes for tribal use, that's exempt from anything that we would look at.
okay. Question next.
Today is the first time that I ever considered the definition of food and fiber to be other than human food. So my understanding from Dr. Peterberry today and talking to her briefly and her talk was that definition is far more broad than I ever assumed. So if I have somebody who wants to feed a Peromyscus to a snake, is that a covered use?
No, based on my past experience and going up the chain with this, no. Food, fur, and fiber, it's not defined, so if it's food use, that is not something that's covered. Just
Even
to be
if they catch
certain,
it?
we're moving in a fast-paced environment. I
Yes.
am going to go back to my leadership and double-check, but I'm giving you the answer as I know it from the last time that I personally dealt with it.
So if they start trapping Peromyscus in the wild and feeding it to their snakes, it doesn't need a protocol for the food animal, and it's not covered and reported at
Correct.
this time.
But your Ayacook may want, oh, I'm sorry, Axel.
Oh, it would definitely
it
be
is human
included.
food. It's human food. It's animals used to feed humans, animals used to get fiber, wool, things like that, because we exempt that too.
This is not PHS. Our assurance is on hold. We don't have PHS funding.
So, are you saying, Axel, that it's not animal food? It's only for human food?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I mean, if it's cows that are used for dog food, though, that may be covered. But feeding a mouse to a snake is not considered food. I mean, it's food for the snake, but it's not under the government definition.
But that animal's not being used for research purposes. That animal's being used to feed a research animal.
Right, but it's a live vertebrate animal while it's alive. And so that's one of the problems we have where people sort of put them into second-class citizenship. They have mice that they want to feed to their raptors or something like that, and then they house them under conditions that aren't appropriate. So they need to be housed appropriately until they're fed. This is a problem we often see, where they figure, oh, they're just the mice that are being used for food.
No, this is totally hypothetical, and currently he's feeding, frozen mice and
Oh,
all
well,
of
then they're
that.
dead. See, then they're not
I
covered either.
understand. I'm trying to understand what Dr. Peterberry said today about the U.S. definition of food, just as something going forward. I've always interpreted it to be livestock, or even horses used for food, and it's not a topic I really want to go into, but
Right.
today you alluded to, it's food, as like reptile food or something like that. So I was asking
Right.
specifically on that clarification.
Because it's not teaching, testing, research, and it is used for food, and that is not specifically defined. Now, we may diverge a little bit with OLA in this case. Sometimes we do. And as I said, this was based on the last time I was personally involved with that interpretation. So I will go back and double check because it's a fast-paced world and a new administration. I don't
Absolutely.
believe that's changed.
And I would argue that with all the things you would have to deal with from a biosafety standpoint, going out
Absolutely.
and trapping Peromyscus,
Absolutely.
it would not be worth it at all.
That's just an example I pulled
Nope.
out of the air, but, and obviously there would be all the snake safety and the animal and the food animal safety handling and all of that jazz. But just to understand the definition of food from the USDA perspective is not currently limited to human food.
Correct.
Thank you.
Okay, so Bob, I had a question on the genetically modified organisms. What is your definition of a genetically modified organism for a mouse?
If you look at the mouse, if it's transgenic, something like that, then you cannot feed them to animals.
And is this captive animals or true wild animals? So my question goes back is I would completely disagree with that statement.
Chris, I think this is under the IBC regulations.
Okay, no, that's fair enough.
Yeah.
Okay, it's a new one to me. So this is something
Yeah.
new.
This is not something that ALAC decrees.
Yeah.
I think this is under IBC, and ALAC is looking for that compliance.
Yeah, they worry about the release of genetically engineered mice into
Right.
the wild, so that you can't do. Now, in an institution, feeding it from one room to another, I'm not quite sure on.
It's under the Office of Biotechnology Activities, OBA. And we've had a very serious case where some genetically modified sheep were used and they didn't incinerate them, they buried them. They got dug up by wild coyotes and dogs, and boy, was that a scandal. That was a real big deal.
Can we go back just a second? I'd like to say something about the regulatory structure. So there is, believe it or not, no definition of the term research in the Animal Welfare Act or its regulations. Similarly, no definition of food. Agencies have to fill in these gaps, whether they choose to do it by formal regulation or these sub-regulatory policies. That's up to them to do, but whatever they do has to be consistent with the statute that Congress wrote, and then there also has to be internal consistency. So what APHIS is doing here is very typical and very necessary to function, and it tends to work more or less. I mean, eventually a case will come up where maybe forces the issue, but there are gaps in these laws, and the agencies do have to fill them in some manner. So if that's APHIS's understanding and they choose not to reduce it to either a written policy, whether it's in the manual, animal care policy manual, or in a formal regulation, that is their decision to make. If they feel it's becoming problematic, they will then move to take the next step and formalize it.
And one other thing I'd like to bring up, going back and putting my ACAW hat back on, if you're capturing wild rodents to feed to snakes, consider how that's going to affect the snakes that are under study, as well as the ecosystem and all the other things we've talked about the past couple of days. So just because USDA is not talking about it, it doesn't mean there aren't welfare issues.
So I hate to ask for clarification on definitions, but I just want to make sure I understand something, and that is, do we consider research to be the generation of generalizable knowledge? Is that reasonable?
Research,
Yeah.
and I'm going to give you the definition as I know it for
Okay.
the animal welfare: teaching, testing, experimentation. Those are research.
Okay. Well, I'm just trying to
Yeah.
make my understanding consistent with what I know about research as defined for human subjects, and so it's the generalizable knowledge thing I'm hung up on. And the second thing I'm hung up on is the material altering of behavior. That's the other one that worries me, and I just want to make sure I understand. For example, if I have a pond and I'm going to and a stream's running through it, I'm going to put some stones in there to make it easier for me to get a hold of the fish I want. Am I altering the fish behavior because they can't get out of the pond as easily and down the stream? So therefore, is that the field study definition is something I'm having trouble with. So this might have been discussed earlier, but
Can I just
yeah,
jump in? First
I'd
of all,
love- yeah.
let's pretend that this is a warm-blooded fish that we're regulating.
Okay.
Okay.
All right then.
I am going to go back to what I was saying. If we fill this in for you, if we create additional guidance, it will be prescriptive.
That's where
And
I'm going.
it will be an engineering standard, and you will probably, a lot of you will say that that's what you want, but a lot of you will tell me that that's not what you want.
Correct.
So cost benefit analysis, right? You can decide to define that yourselves and have a discussion. I will say that if APHIS finds that you are way off the mark with something, that there's something that where we consult with experts or based on past experience, we see that something materially alters a behavior and the IACUC says it's not, we're going to call you out on that. It's got to be pretty egregious. It's got to be pretty obvious, but we will. But for the most part, as it stands now, without additional guidance, it is up to the IACUC.
We get questions from IACUCs all the time, and my take on it is to ask yourself, what is the normal, unaltered behavior? What would you expect this animal to do in these conditions over that particular time? Could be the breeding season, non-breeding season. So look at what the normal, unaltered behavior would be, and then look at what changes. What kind of change? How long is that change or the effects? And sometimes you may not know that because these are wild animals. You let them go, you don't see them again. Although often literature will fill that in for you to some extent. So what kind of effect, how long, and how I guess I want to say how much. And there's also a biological definition that I'm sure nobody would want to use, but let me tell you what that is. And that from the point of view of an animal ecologist, the ultimate behavioral question is, how many offspring have you left behind with your genes? That is the ultimate criterion for success of an animal's life, but from the animal's point of view. And so if you take an animal out of its breeding territory and another guy comes along and gets what we call an EPC, an extra pair copulation with that female, and that female is now giving birth to somebody else's offspring, that would be a severe reduction in fitness for that first animal. And from an evolutionary point of view, that's huge. But that's not a very practical thing for an IACUC, especially because you probably don't know that it happened. So I think people who are on IACUCs really need to step back and say, how long, how much, what type, and go from there. If something is temporal, if something is not serious, if something is of a minor characteristic, it wouldn't to me, it wouldn't rise to that level.
By the way, I'll change my example from fish to beavers. Okay, does that make it easier?
This is still warm-blooded, this fish?
Sure, why not?
Okay,
It's genetically modified.
I would like to respond to that, but I want to take my ALAC tie off, and then I'm going to agree with Ellen 100% on that from an ASM perspective, not from an ALAC perspective.
Absolutely.
Very quickly, Bob, would you offer that clarification of stress becoming distress as an example of when you materially altered a animal's behavior? We talked about that earlier. I'm not so sure everybody was here when you offered that clarification.
If you're pushing an animal into distress, okay, distress is actually defined by example, inability to maintain homeostasis. You push an animal into that point, that's a significant alteration of behavior.
The problem is
that would probably go towards harm rather than material alteration.
The
of behavior,
problem is knowing that that's occurring from mere observation, because any two animals, even of the same species, will react very differently to the same stimuli. So some birds will scream and holler and bite the heck out of you, and others will just lie limp in your hands, and even after you open your hand to release it. Which one of those is experiencing stress? Which one is experiencing distress? Does it matter how long you've held them? Very tough to know, virtually impossible to know.
And I would posit that you also have to consider subclinical physiologic issues that may result from stress versus distress, and that it may not become immediately apparent.
Okay, I'm going to quickly loop back and then turn the mic over to others. Just to loop back on this whole issue of live lure animals. So to the extent if we could consider being conscientious about what needs to be reported from the sake of being in compliance with the laws and regulations, and then what is, again, animal welfare. So if you have these live lures, rodents, whether they're reportable or not to USDA and how they interpret that definition, those animals still need care. So I would suggest that it still may need IACUC oversight from the purpose of animal husbandry and best husbandry practices. So for example, we had a study in Forest Service where they had a bunch of raptors. They want to go out seasonally and actually basically check nests, see if they're nesting in a certain area and how many. of these paired raptors were nesting, but they wanted to use live lures, live mice, to call them in so they could basically follow the animals back or observe them going back to their nests. And to me, the Ayacook became more concerned, even though there was no handling of the raptors, they were just watching them fly in and fly back. Most of our Ayacook commentary and time spent discussion was about what they were doing with the damn mice, okay? Now, in these cases, they were actually purchased from a pet store, so let's not even go down that road for the moment. But I had to, yeah, I know that. So I had to ask them what was their husbandry manual for maintaining those mice over the season. And they actually had to develop one because, unfortunately, they didn't really have a good one in hand. It was mostly a verbal hand-me-down training over the years of how to care for these mice and how to, feeding and cleaning and et cetera, and I asked them to put together, and I helped them put together a husbandry manual of how to maintain those animals, even if they were to be fed out, and we didn't necessarily have to report on our annual report to USDA, but we still had to maintain those animals under proper husbandry management and care. So I just wanted to try to divide that up into what's animal welfare and what we have to actually report on our annual report. Okay?
I heartily endorse that. Compliance with the laws is the minimum. You have to do that. It's the law. Doesn't mean that's all you should do. And everybody is here devoting 2-3 days of their time because they want to do more. They want to do the best possible job for these animals. So there really shouldn't even be an issue among us about, is that all you need to do? And if they're not covered, can you stop there? I don't see it that way, and I'm kind of guessing that none of you do.
Yeah, I was going to comment on the material alteration of behavior. In fact, that was my question to begin with. We actually use one example, and I was curious how this would fly with everybody, that we tell our PIs and we use this to kind of draw the line. And since we have a lot of coastline and water, we say, imagine going to the mouth of the Mississippi in a boat and you want to count dolphins down there. And if you anchor up and you open your beer and then you get out your lab notebook and you count them all day long, no big deal. There's no protocol. But if you decide that, okay, I see a pod of dolphins, I'm going to crank the boat up and I'm going to go follow them, then you're altering whatever their behavior is. And that's how we use to make that split. And I was kind of curious to see what other people had to say.
Well, considering you're running into the Marine Mammal Protection Act, I'd say that the need for a permit is a pretty good indication that, especially under marine mammal permit, and even the lower tier, that you probably are crossing that line. That's a fairly easy touchstone, maybe not absolute, but it's a good touchstone.
Yeah. Hey, so this is a quick question, not an animal welfare question. Like I get that in this example, but back to a mammal that would be covered. Are specimens that are trapped and euthanized and sort of for museum collections to catalog, but without a real sort of specific or current research component, would those be reportable? And that's just my question about, reportable in that case.
So I'm channeling the Animal Welfare Inspection Guide, and there's a whole section under annual reporting. I think it's page 746. And I think they use that exact example. So that as long, the key here is harvesting using euthanasia methods. In other words, any method that causes rapid unconsciousness without any evident signs of pain or distress. So that would not be reported, as long as you're collecting those animals using a humane method that meets our definition of euthanasia. Yeah.
Are you asking about protocol review, or are you asking about reporting?
I'm asking about reporting.
Okay.
Right. So no, you wouldn't report it. I kind of liken that to people who have, in the lab animal world, who take tissues from an animal that was used in a live animal protocol. Once that animal is dead, USDA no longer will follow that animal because there are no welfare issues associated with it.
However, if you are taking a live animal into your building and killing it, it's covered. If you find it dead in the road, it's not covered. But if you're bringing it live and you're killing it, if you're going to a slaughterhouse and asking for liver samples and they're killing them anyway, then that's not covered.
This question is primarily for Dr. Thompson. Can you explain how the National Park Service has defined field study and maybe give an example of a PI coming to you with a project that they thought was going to require a protocol, and you made the decision it was a field study, and maybe a example of vice versa?
Sure, absolutely. And we do, in the guidance document that we developed that flow charts from, we did give a table of some kind of stereotypic examples of where we would fall into field study versus research versus management. But classic ones that we get are bat and bird misnetting surveys, a lot of inventory and monitoring protocols that we get that come to us either through our INM network. They are definitely they're conducting research as well as just collecting population information for management purposes, but they're often going to be collecting data that will be used later for research. But the techniques that they're using are pretty standard techniques. They outline, I showed you that form earlier that we have available to us, and it's in your slide deck, but it just briefly catches a lot of the information that OLA is asking for with regard to that kind of a review for an IACUC, but just saying, where are you doing it, what are you doing it, why are you doing it, how are you doing it, and what species are you looking at. And if it truly is a quick misnet, they're banding or doing morphometric data and releasing the animals, I would say I don't think any of those we've approved as research. We've approved them as field studies. So bats and birds that are really simple studies like that are pretty basic. Ones that we've had that come in that folks think it's a field study, some of the things that we've had where they've involved more invasive procedures, either euthanasia methods that were not acceptable with conditions under AVMA that our IACUC had welfare concerns about, but we're still willing to approve with conditions. We would not approve that as a field study, even if the other techniques were very minimal or not very invasive, harmful, or materially altering the behavior. But that euthanasia method has sometimes pushed them into a situation where we've been a little concerned about what the potential pain and distress would be. So we would want to have an annual review on that one and have reporting done depending on what the outcome would be. Does that help? Yeah, absolutely.
I want to, again, ALAC tie off now. I want to go back to those animals that were killed as part of the field study, put into a systematics collection. We hope that those animals are going to be used for decades, centuries into the future. So I know for a fact that I have measured bobcat skulls that were put up by Teddy Roosevelt, and I guarantee he did not have an IACUC protocol for that.
It's probably hunting anyway.
No, it was research.
I'd also like to impart a little bit of additional information about permits that I haven't touched on because it is an issue in terms of timing. I want to tell you that if one of your researchers should go out and start working before they have permits, they have way worse problems than your IACUC because all of those laws carry civil and criminal penalties. Civil penalties in the case of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act starting at $1,500, ranging all the way up to potential imprisonment up to 5 years. Now, obviously, first offense, not likely. But the point is, when I nag them about their permits, I always say that to scare the hell out of them. And it usually works. So they've got way worse problems. But the very worst one, even if it was unintentional, they misread the date, whatever, it expired the day before and they misread it, is they may never get permits to work again and their career is over in terms of field research. So just keep that in mind, that they have reasons to not start until they have permits that have nothing to do with the IACUC, and it's great that you want to remind them. You should remind them, but they have an independent reason to be careful about that.
So just going to follow up a little bit on Tracy's example, and I'll just offer a slight variation on the theme. Is a lot of times these days, particularly with bats, people may be misnetting them, but they're generally also taking wing biopsies, or they might be taking some other samples, whether it's blood for DNA or something, or what am I talking about? Fur, feather, fur from DNA analysis. So to the extent is you got to make sure that you know exactly what the biologists are intending to do. That could change it, obviously, from something that might be considered a field study into something that's not. Or if they get injured while they're doing this mist netting, then what happens? Okay, does that change the conditions of it being a waiver into something else? So we will have to be careful when you're going through that process of considering it as a field study. And I personally have a tendency not to just make a hard policy and then just stick with that, but look at every research proposal on a case-by-case basis, because sometimes they just have those variations on the theme.
And we do look at those. We also do have an SOP on bat procedures that are common that we would go ahead and routinely accept without any additional we'd still review the protocol to see what procedures they're going to do, but it's usually a much faster approval. If they do things outside of those approved, kind of pre-approved procedures, we would definitely do more information gathering and more review.
Our last question.
Regarding the question of feeding GMs to reptiles, the NIH guidelines on recombinant DNA were revised in 2016, so I'm wondering if your data from 2014 to 2016 takes into account the fact that GEMs that are bred, so a mouse, a transgenic mouse that's just bred in a biosafety level 1 is exempt from the guidelines now. Does ALAC still consider that a GEM that's reviewed by the IBC, because it's not, that can't be fed to a reptile?
Manny, that's a great question. The data and the findings that I was reporting on there were those between 14 and 16. So that's new stuff. I don't know how many of them came in after that change in 16. But I would suspect most of those are probably before.
Okay, I want to thank the panel again. This has been an excellent day, a lot of good knowledge and a lot of good PowerPoints that people did a lot of work on with tons of information on that and hot links for you. So don't forget to take advantage of those resources. Okay, we're done for the day. See you at 8 tomorrow morning.